I watched him pack a single, battered suitcase, the same one he brought into our marriage 10 years ago, and walk out the door without looking back. I felt a surge of triumph, finally free from the dead weight of a man who I thought was draining my life and my bank account. I even threw a stack of bills at his feet as a parting insult. But 3 hours later, a lawyer called with a trembling voice. He didn't leave me because he stopped loving me. He left because he was dying, and every cent I accused him of stealing was actually a life insurance premium he spent his last breath securing for my future. I won the divorce, I kept the house, and I have millions in the bank. But as I stand in our empty bedroom holding his terminal diagnosis, I realize I didn't just lose a husband. I threw away the only man who was willing to die in silence just so I could live in comfort. How do I tell a dead man I'm sorry? If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every subscription motivates us to keep bringing you better stories every day. And now we're curious. Where are you watching from? And what are you doing while watching this video? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. The silver candlelight flickered against the crystal glasses, casting long, distorted shadows across the mahogany table that felt like a canyon between us. It was our 10th anniversary, the tin anniversary, but the only thing metallic in the room was the cold, clinical edge of the legal envelope resting next to my champagne flute. I watched him across the table, his shoulders slightly hunched in that cheap, off-the-rack suit he insisted on wearing, even to a Michelin star restaurant I paid for. For years, I had convinced myself that his silence was a sign of incompetence, that his lack of ambition was a parasite feeding on my success. Every promotion I earned, every zero added to my bank account, only made his presence feel heavier, like a lead weight dragging my soaring kite back to the mud. I didn't see a partner anymore. I saw a shadow that had overstayed its welcome in my spotlight. "Sign it, Julian," I said, my voice as sharp as the diamonds on my fingers, devoid of the warmth that used to exist when we were young and poor. I didn't look at his face. I focused on his hands, those hands that used to build me bookshelves but now seemed to do nothing but reach for my wallet. He didn't flinch. He didn't beg. He didn't even ask why, as if he had been waiting for this executioner's blade to fall for a long time. The restaurant was filled with the soft hum of happy couples, the clinking of silverware, and the scent of expensive lilies, but all I could smell was the suffocating scent of a dead marriage. He reached for the gold pen I had bought him for his 30th birthday, a gift he'd never used because he said it was too expensive to lose. His fingers trembled, a slight rhythmic shudder that I dismissed as the cowardice of a man losing his meal ticket. With a slow, deliberate motion, he scrawled his name across the bottom of the divorce papers. No fight, no alimony demands, just a silent surrender that irritated me more than a shouting match would have. He closed the folder and pushed it back toward me, his movements sluggish, almost ghost-like. "Is that it?" I sneered, tucking the papers into my designer handbag with a sense of predatory triumph. 10 years, and you have nothing to say? No excuses for why you've spent the last 2 years drifting like a ghost in my house? I wanted him to hurt. I wanted him to scream so I could feel justified in my cruelty. But Julian just looked at me, his eyes clouded with something I mistook for exhaustion, but would later realize was the look of a man staring at a sunset he'd never see again. He stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the marble floor, and for a fleeting second he reached out as if to touch my cheek. I recoiled, the disgust visible on my face. His hand froze in midair, then slowly curled into a fist and dropped to his side. "I packed a suitcase this morning," he whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "It's by the door. I didn't take anything that wasn't mine when I met you." I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed uncomfortably. "Good, because everything in that house was bought with my sweat and my tears. Go back to the nothingness you came from, Julian." I stood up to leave, my heels clicking a rhythm of victory, convinced that I had finally pruned the dying branch from my life to let myself bloom. I walked out into the cool night air, feeling lighter than I had in a decade, never noticing that he hadn't followed me out. I didn't see him lean against the table for support, his face turning a sickly gray as he clutched his chest, struggling to breathe in the silence I had left behind. I was too busy celebrating my freedom to realize that as he walked toward the exit with that single, battered suitcase, he wasn't just leaving my house, He was taking the only heart that ever beat for me into the dark. I hopped into my car and sped away, watching his lonely figure disappear in the rearview mirror. I thought I had finally cut the anchor, but as I glanced at the passenger seat, I saw his wedding ring sitting there, glinting under the streetlights, next to a small, crumpled brown paper bag from a pharmacy I didn't recognize. The drive home was supposed to feel like a victory lap, a high-speed escape from the mediocrity that Julian had draped over my life like a heavy, dusty shroud. Instead, the silence in my luxury SUV felt deafening, amplified by the rhythmic ticking of the heater. Every time I glanced at the passenger seat, my eyes were drawn to that crumpled brown pharmacy bag he'd left behind. It looked pathetic, an eyesore against the pristine Italian leather. I reached over and shoved it into the glove box, refusing to let his weakness ruin my first hour of autonomy. I told myself the shaking in my hands was just residual adrenaline, not the first tremors of a collapsing world. When I pulled into the driveway of our estate in Greenwich, the house looked like a fortress of success, every window gleaming with the wealth I had built. I expected to feel a sense of homecoming, but as I stepped through the front door, the air felt thin, stripped of the quiet warmth that usually greeted me. Julian was already there, standing in the foyer next to that single battered suitcase. He was staring at a framed photograph on the console table, a picture of us from our 3rd anniversary, back when we lived in a studio in Brooklyn and shared a single mattress on the floor. I felt a surge of irritation. "I thought I told you to be gone by the time I got back," I snapped, the sound of my voice echoing sharply off the marble walls. I marched over to the wet bar and poured myself a double scotch. Julian finally looked at me, and for a second, I saw a profound, hollow pity in his eyes. He reached into his pocket and laid a heavy set of keys silently on the cold stone surface. "The mortgage papers, the security codes, and the contact for the pool maintenance are in the blue folder in your office. I also fixed the leak in the pantry sink this afternoon. And don't forget, trash day is Tuesday, you always used to miss it." I let out a sharp, mocking laugh. How noble. Is this where you ask for a severance package? I reached into my purse, pulled out a stack of $100 bills, and placed them firmly on top of his suitcase. "Take it. It's more than you've earned in a decade of being my shadow." Julian didn't move. He didn't even look at the money. He just stood there, his face translucent under the harsh LED lights. "You always thought I was the one who needed saving, Sarah," he whispered, his breath hitching in a way that made my chest tighten. He picked up his suitcase, ignoring the cash, and walked toward the door. As he passed, a faint, metallic scent hit me, the smell of a hospital. I was finally alone. I headed toward my office to bury myself in work, but as I opened the blue folder, my heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a list of passwords. Behind the bills was a ledger, thousands of entries documenting every cent I thought he had wasted. Julian hadn't been spending my money. He had been diverting his own small disability checks and every penny of the allowance I gave him into a high-yield trust fund for me. He had been quietly rebuilding the wealth I was losing to my failing tech investments, the ones I had hidden from him. But at the very back, clipped to a life insurance policy worth $5 million, was a handwritten note from an oncologist at Sloan Kettering. My breath hitched as I read the first line: "Patient Julian Vance, treatment ceased by request. Prognosis, 3 to 4 weeks." I realized then that the vacations he took alone weren't for leisure, they were for chemotherapy, and he had just walked out into a freezing Connecticut night with nowhere to go. The medical report from Sloan Kettering felt like a shard of ice piercing through my lungs. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, treatment ceased by request. The words blurred as hot, bitter tears flooded my eyes. I didn't sit down. I didn't have the luxury of time. Every ounce of warmth in this Greenwich estate seemed to have followed Julian out the door. All those times he was absent, times I had mocked as laziness, and every evening he returned pale and trembling, which I had ridiculed as weakness. He had been facing the firing squad of chemotherapy alone. He had been quietly enduring the ravages of death while using his final breaths to reconstruct the ruins of my tech company, fixing the financial craters I had created with my own arrogance. He wasn't a shadow lurking in my light, he was the foundation holding my world together, while he was literally crumbling from within. I bolted for his office, my heels clicking frantically against the cold marble of the hallway. "Julian!" I screamed, my voice cracking in the hollow expanse of the mansion. There was no answer, only the faint, lingering scent of his sandalwood cologne. I lunged for the front door, stumbling over the threshold, but the sting in my ankle was nothing compared to the suffocating terror in my chest. The tracks of his tires on the thin Connecticut snow were already fading. I fumbled for my phone, dialing his number 10, 20 times, only to be met by the mechanical coldness of his voicemail. "Please, Julian, pick up. Please." I sobbed into the wind. I remembered the pharmacy bag shoved in my SUV's glove box. I tore it open, finding high-dose painkillers and a scrap of paper with the address of the Bluebird Motel, a place so cheap and forgotten that it felt like a grave he had picked out for himself. I threw the car into gear, the tires screaming against the asphalt as I pushed the engine to its limit. I drove like a madwoman, the speedometer climbing into territory I'd never dared to touch. Through the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers, I saw flashes of him, the way he fixed the pantry sink just hours ago, the way he looked at our old Brooklyn photo with a final, tragic devotion. I had called him a failure, but the only failure here was me, a woman with millions in the bank but too spiritually bankrupt to recognize the purest love until I'd kicked it out into the freezing night. I swerved into the neon-lit parking lot of the motel, the sign flickering like a dying heartbeat. His old car was there, tucked in the darkest corner, covered in a shroud of frost. I leapt out, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and sprinted toward room 14. I pounded on the thin wooden door until my knuckles bled. "Julian, open the door! I know you're in there." The door creaked open, but it wasn't Julian who stood there. It was the woman I'd seen him with at the hotel, the one I had assumed was his mistress. She looked at me with bloodshot eyes, her face twisted in a mixture of grief and pure, unadulterated disgust. In her hand, she held Julian's old watch, its leather strap worn and familiar. "You're too late, Sarah," she whispered, her voice trembling with a rage that silenced my screams. "He didn't want you to see him wither away. He didn't want your pity after a decade of your contempt. He just wanted to leave you a future you didn't deserve." She stepped aside, revealing an empty, unmade bed and a discarded oxygen tank. "Where is he?" I choked out, clutching the doorframe for support. She checked the time on his watch and pointed toward the distant, fading siren of an ambulance disappearing into the dark. "He collapsed 5 minutes ago. And given his DNR order, Sarah, he might not even make it to the ER." The siren's wail was a dying echo in the distance, a haunting sound that seemed to pull the very soul out of my body. I didn't wait for Elena to say another word. I sprinted back to my SUV, the frozen slush soaking through my silk stockings, but I felt nothing but a numbing, paralyzing cold that started in my marrow. The drive to the county hospital was a blur of red lights ignored and near misses that should have ended my life, but I was already dead inside. I was chasing a ghost, a man I had spent years belittling, only to find out he was the only thing that had kept me human. When I skidded into the emergency bay, the fluorescent lights of the hospital felt like a physical assault, bright, sterile, and mocking the dark chaos of my heart. I burst through the double doors, my designer coat stained with rain, looking every bit the broken woman I truly was. "Julian Vance! Where is he?" I screamed at the triage nurse, my voice echoing off the linoleum floors. Before she could answer, Elena appeared behind me, her expression a mask of professional disgust. She didn't look at me with sympathy. She looked at me as if I were a stain on Julian's legacy. "He's in Resus 4, Sarah," she said, her voice cutting through the hospital hum. "But before you go in there, you need to understand the loser you just divorced. Julian didn't just hire me for the paperwork, he hired me to save your name from the mud." I stopped, my hand trembling on the cold metal handle of the trauma ward. "What are you talking about?" I whispered. Elena opened a black leather folio, the twin to the one in my office. "Your CTO didn't just embezzle, Sarah. He left you with a massive federal liability. Julian didn't use that allowance for himself. He sold his family's land in Vermont, the only thing he had left of his parents, to settle your debts before the auditors arrived. He traded his own treatment, his only chance at survival, to buy you a second chance at a career you valued more than him." The air left my lungs. My knees buckled, and I leaned against the wall, the scent of antiseptic making me gag. Every insult I'd hurled at him parasite, dead weight was a stone I had used to build his casket. I pushed through the doors of Resus 4, past a startled doctor who tried to warn me about his precarious state. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic, agonizing hiss of a ventilator. Julian looked so small under the white sheets, a fragile, translucent version of the man I had married. His skin was the color of parchment, and his hands were covered in bruises from failed IV lines. I fell to my knees beside the bed, grasping his hand. It was ice cold. "Julian," I choked out, the name tasting like ash. "I'm here. I saw it all." "I'm so sorry. Please, don't leave me with this guilt." His eyelids flickered, a movement so slight it was almost ghostly. The monitor beeped a slow, irregular rhythm, a countdown to a silence I wasn't prepared for. I pressed his hand to my cheek, sobbing into his palm, begging for a miracle I didn't deserve. I looked up at the monitor, watching the green line falter. He was slipping away into a darkness I had helped create. But as the sun began to peek through the hospital blinds, Julian's fingers gave a sudden, weak squeeze against mine. His eyes opened, clouded and distant. He didn't look at me with anger. He looked at me with a terrifying, hollow kindness. He struggled to point at his battered suitcase in the corner. "The bottom compartment," he rasped, his voice a ghost of a sound. "The key. It's not for the house. It's for the beginning." He drifted back into unconsciousness before I could ask what he meant. I lunged for the suitcase, tearing at the lining until my nails bled, finally finding a rusted iron key attached to a photograph I hadn't seen in a decade. It was a picture of a small, dilapidated cabin in the woods, the place where he had hidden the one thing that proved I was never the self-made woman I claimed to be. The rusted iron key felt like a frozen coal in my palm, searing my skin with a truth I wasn't yet brave enough to face. I stared at the photograph, the edges yellowed and curled, showing a modest, weathered cabin tucked deep into the pines of the Catskills. It was the beginning, as Julian had called it. The place where we spent our honeymoon because we couldn't afford a flight to Paris. A sanctuary I had spent the last 7 years pretending didn't exist because it didn't fit the glossy narrative of my high society life. I looked back at Julian, his breath now a shallow, rhythmic rattle against the hospital's sterile oxygen. And for the first time, I didn't see a man who had failed me. I saw a man who had spent a decade playing the villain just so I could remain the hero of my own story. Leaving his bedside felt like tearing off a limb, but the desperation to understand him, to find some shred of his soul that I hadn't already trampled, pushed me back out into the freezing Connecticut dawn. I drove 3 hours north, the engine of my SUV roaring in protest as I climbed the winding, icy roads. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin stood there like a silent sentinel. It was smaller than I remembered, and as I stepped onto the porch, the wood groaned under my weight as if recognizing the woman who had abandoned it. The door swung open with a heavy metallic thud, and the scent of cedar and Julian's sandalwood cologne washed over me so fiercely I had to lean against the frame to keep from collapsing. The interior was a time capsule of the man I had erased. On the small wooden table sat a stack of journals, dated back 10 years. I opened the most recent one, my eyes racing across his neat, steady script. I expected to find a diary of his pain or a record of my cruelty. Instead, I found a blueprint of my own success. Julian wasn't just a shadow. He was a brilliant software architect who had quietly resigned from his own rising career the moment my startup faltered. Every major breakthrough I thought I had achieved through sheer talent was documented here. The venture capitalists who randomly called me? Julian had spent months ghostwriting their technical audits to prove my worth. The patent that saved my company? Julian had spent his nights in this very cabin, working by candlelight to solve the coding errors I couldn't fix, then quietly uploading the solutions to my server so I'd find them in the morning and think I was a genius. He had spent 10 years letting me believe I was a sun, never letting me know he was the gravity keeping me from spinning into the void. I moved toward the back of the cabin, my heart hammering a painful rhythm against my ribs. There, tucked inside a small, fireproof box, was a single, sealed envelope addressed to Sarah, for when you finally stop running. I tore it open, my breath hitching in the frigid air. Inside wasn't a letter of forgiveness, but a medical file from 5 years ago, the year I thought my world had ended because I couldn't conceive. I stared at the original lab results, the ones Julian had intercepted and hidden, replacing them with a fake negative to protect me. The real result was a positive pregnancy test, followed by a pathology report of a silent miscarriage. I remembered that week. I was in the middle of a high-stakes product launch, working 20-hour days, fueled by caffeine and ambition. Julian had known. He had watched me lose our child to my ego, and instead of letting me carry that crushing guilt, he had convinced the doctor to tell me I was simply infertile, letting me blame him for our childless marriage for 5 long, bitter years. I slumped onto the dusty floor, the weight of his sacrifice pressing the air from my lungs. But as I went to put the papers back, a small, modern flash drive fell out of the envelope. It was labeled, "Play this when the house is empty." I plugged it into my laptop with trembling hands, and the screen flickered to life, showing a video Julian had recorded only 2 days ago, his face gaunt and his eyes sunken. "Sarah," he whispered on screen, "if you're watching this, you found the cabin. There's one more thing I need you to do before I'm gone. And it's the only thing I've ever lied to you about for my own sake." The video on the laptop screen flickered, its blue light casting a ghostly pallor over the dusty cabin walls. Julian's face was a map of exhaustion, his voice a mere rasp that seemed to travel from a far-off, painful distance. "Sarah," he said on the recording, his eyes searching the lens as if he could see my soul through the future. "I lied. I told you I saved your company for you. I told you I stayed for you. But the truth is, I stayed for the girl I met in Brooklyn, the one who didn't care about the crown she was building. I kept the secret of our baby because I was terrified that if you knew the cost of your success, you'd stop being the woman I loved, the woman who believes she can conquer the world. I was selfish, Sarah. I wanted to keep your light burning, even if it was burning me alive." The screen went black, leaving me in a silence so profound it felt like the world had ended. I didn't cry. I was past tears. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity that felt like a death sentence. I grabbed the flash drive and the iron key, and I ran. The drive back to the hospital was a descent into a private hell. I pushed the SUV through the winding mountain passes of the Catskills, the tires skidding on patches of black ice, my mind replaying every cruel word I had ever spat at him. I had called him a parasite while he was my life support. I had called him a loser while he was the only reason I was a winner. By the time I reached the hospital parking lot, the sun was sinking behind the Connecticut skyline, painting the clouds in bruises of purple and orange. I sprinted through the lobby, past the security guards, and toward the intensive care unit. My heart was a drum in my ears, beating out a single, desperate prayer: "Stay, stay, stay." When I burst into his room, the chaotic energy of the morning had been replaced by a heavy, reverent stillness. Julian was no longer on the ventilator. He was propped up slightly, his chest moving in slow, agonizing hitches. Elena, the lawyer, was gone. The room was just him, the steady, rhythmic beep of the monitors, and the creeping shadows of the evening. I fell to his side, taking his hand in both of mine. It was light, fragile as a bird's wing. "Julian," I whispered, my voice thick with the weight of everything I now knew. I went to the cabin. I saw the video. I saw the journals. I saw everything. His fingers didn't squeeze back, but his eyes opened, just a sliver, and for a heartbeat, the clouded gray cleared to reveal the man who had looked at me with pure adoration on our wedding day. "You found it," he breathed, the words barely audible over the hum of the heart monitor. "I'm sorry, Julian," I sobbed, pressing my forehead against his knuckles. "I'm so sorry I made you carry the weight of my life on your back. I'm sorry I hated you for being the only person who truly loved me. I don't want the company. I don't want the money. I just want the boy from Brooklyn back." I felt a sudden, sharp pang of realization. He had spent 5 years letting me hate him for our childlessness, just to save me from the guilt of a miscarriage I had caused with my own ambition. He had protected my soul at the cost of his own heart. He struggled to speak, his hand trembling as he tried to reach for my face. I guided his palm to my cheek, leaning into his touch. "Sarah," he whispered, a small, sad smile touching his pale lips. "Don't be sorry. It was a privilege to watch you fly. Even if I was just the wind you forgot was there." Suddenly, the heart monitor began a long, protesting drone. The green line went flat. I waited for the nurses to rush in with paddles, but then I remembered his DNR order. There was no chaos, just a quiet, devastating finality. I watched the life leave his eyes, his hand going limp against my face. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I stayed there for hours, holding his cold hand, until the night nurse gently reminded me of the suitcase. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I felt for the hidden blue envelope in the lining. I tore it open, expecting a final goodbye, but inside was a small silver key to a safe deposit box and a letter that began, "Elena isn't just my lawyer, Sarah. She's the mother of the person who is going to take everything from you, for your own good." The words on the page seemed to vibrate, blurring into a distorted mess of ink as the vault room tilted on its axis. The mother of the person who is going to take everything from you. My heart, already shattered, felt like it was being ground into dust. I looked at the silver key, then back at the letter, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Who was Elena Rossi? For years, I had assumed Julian was a blank slate, a man whose only world was the one I allowed him to inhabit. Now, from the grave, he was revealing a hidden architecture of a life I hadn't been invited to. The bitterness I had felt for a decade flared up, a defensive fire against the agonizing pain of his loss. I wanted to believe he had cheated. It was easier to be angry at a betrayer than to be broken by a saint. The private vault in downtown Stamford felt like a cold, pressurized tomb. I slid the key into the lock of box 402, my fingers numb. Inside, there were no bundles of cash or deeds to hidden villas. There was a single hand-knitted baby blanket, faded blue, with the initials J.V. Jr. embroidered in the corner, and a legal folder that felt heavier than lead. My blood turned to ice as I pulled out a birth certificate. The father's name, Julian Vance. The mother's name, Elena Rossi. The date of birth, 5 years ago. That was the year of my silent miscarriage, the year I had buried myself in work and locked Julian out of my heart. I felt a surge of cold fury. While I was mourning our lost child, he was starting another family? But as I tore through the legal documents, the betrayal took a turn that left me breathless. Elena wasn't a mistress. She was an old friend from Julian's Brooklyn days, a woman who owed her life to his kindness. After my doctor told Julian I was infertile, the lie he had commissioned to protect me from the guilt of my own stress-induced miscarriage, Julian had used a surrogate. He had wanted to give me a child, a miracle to heal the rift between us. But when the boy, Julian Jr., was born with the same rare genetic heart condition that was now killing Julian, he couldn't bring himself to tell me. He didn't want to burden me with a sick child while I was building my empire. So he funded their lives in secret, using every penny of his secret investments to pay for the boy's surgeries, all while letting me call him a dead weight who did nothing with his time. The final document was a trust agreement. Julian had been the majority shareholder of my company for months, buying up the debt I had recklessly accrued. He hadn't done it to control me. He had done it to create a safety net. But there was a catch, a morality clause. The trust, the house, and the company would only remain in my name if I accepted full guardianship of Julian Jr. upon Julian's death. If I refused, everything would be liquidated to pay for the boy's lifelong care, leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back. The heavy steel door of the vault room groaned open. I turned, expecting a security guard, but found Elena standing there. She wasn't wearing her lawyer's suit. She looked haggard, her eyes red from weeping. Beside her stood a small boy in a wheelchair, his face a hauntingly beautiful mirror of the man I had just lost. He was clutching a worn-out teddy bear that I recognized it was the one Julian had bought on the day I thought we'd lost everything. "The auditors are at your office, Sarah," Elena whispered, her voice a jagged edge of exhaustion. "They're freezing your accounts as we speak. You have exactly 4 hours to sign the guardianship papers. You can save your empire and become the mother he always knew you could be. Or you can walk out that door and let us both drown in his debt." What's it going to be? Thought. The cold, sterile air of the vault room seemed to solidify around me as I stared at the boy in the wheelchair. He didn't look like a stranger. He looked like a memory I had tried to erase. His eyes, those deep, soulful pools of mahogany, were Julian's eyes, staring back at me with a terrifyingly innocent curiosity. My world was bifurcating into 2 impossible paths, one leading back to the glass-walled offices of my tech empire where the auditors were currently dismantling my pride, and the other leading toward this fragile, broken piece of the man I had loved and loathed in equal measure. My phone buzzed incessantly in my coat pocket, vibrations of panic from my CFO, no doubt, but the sound felt tinny and distant, like a radio playing in a house that was already underwater. 4 hours, Sarah. Elena repeated, her voice steady but her hands trembling as she adjusted the boy's blanket. Julian didn't do this to trap you. He did it because he believed that underneath all that iron-plated ambition, there was still the woman who used to share a single mattress in Brooklyn. He wanted you to have a reason to keep fighting after he was gone. I looked at the legal papers sitting on the metal table, the ink of Julian's signature still seeming fresh, a ghostly command from the beyond. If I signed, I would inherit a child who was a ticking time bomb of medical expenses and emotional demands. If I didn't, I would lose the company I had sacrificed my soul to build. It was the ultimate test of my character, a choice between the crown I had stolen and the cross Julian had carried for us both. I stepped closer to the boy, my heels clicking a hesitant rhythm on the concrete floor. He reached out a small, pale hand, his fingers brushing against the silk of my designer coat. "Are you the angel?" he whispered, his voice a frail reed in the silence. My heart gave a violent, agonizing thud. Julian had told him I was an angel, while I was screaming at his father in our kitchen, calling him a parasite and a failure. Julian was sitting by this boy's bed, spinning tales of a golden woman who was too busy saving the world to come home. The guilt was no longer a dull ache. It was a physical weight, crushing my lungs until I had to gasp for air. I realized then that my empire was built on a foundation of his silence and his suffering. Every brick of my success was paid for with the time he could have spent with his son or the money he could have used to save his own life. I looked at Elena, the woman I had judged so harshly. "Why did you agree to this?" I asked, my voice barely a thread. "Why let him hide you both away?" She looked down at the boy, a sad, weary smile touching her lips. "Because he loved you, Sarah. He loved you enough to let you be the villain so you wouldn't have to be a victim. And I loved him enough to give him the only thing he couldn't get from you, a legacy." The buzzer on the vault door sounded, a harsh reminder that time was hemorrhaging. The auditors were likely nipping at the heels of my personal accounts now. I reached for the gold pen Julian had left in the box, the one I had once mocked as too expensive to lose. My hand shook as I touched the tip to the signature line. This wasn't just a legal document, it was a confession. By signing this, I was admitting that my entire life had been a lie, and that the self-made woman was a myth crafted by a dying man. I looked at the boy Julian Jr. and saw the shadow of the husband I had just buried. I didn't know how to be a mother. I didn't know how to love something that required more than a quarterly report. But as I watched the boy's chest hitch in that familiar, labored way, I knew I couldn't walk away. I couldn't let Julian die a second time by abandoning the one thing he had fought to keep alive. I signed the papers with a jagged, desperate flourish, handing them to Elena just as my phone screen lit up with a final, devastating notification from my bank. All personal and corporate accounts frozen. Possession of estate scheduled for 8 a.m. I looked at the boy, my son now, and realized the empire I had just signed to protect was already gone. I was a mother with a dying child, no money, and a house I was about to be evicted from. "What now?" I whispered. Elena looked at the boy, then back at me with a terrifying grin. "Now, we go to the one place the auditors can't touch. The place Julian bought back for you." The transition from the cold, metallic silence of the vault to the biting reality of the streets felt like a plunge into an icy river. By the time we reached the sidewalk, the notification on my phone was no longer a warning, it was a death knell. My credit cards were plastic husks. My access to the empire I had bled for was severed. Elena helped me lift the boy, little Julian, into the back seat of my SUV, the only asset the auditors hadn't seized yet because it was registered under Julian's shell company. As I pulled away from the curb, I saw a black sedan, the vultures from the bank circling the block. They weren't just taking my money. They were waiting for me to fail. But for the first time in a decade, I wasn't looking at the stock tickers. I was looking at the rearview mirror, at a pale, brave boy who was staring at the city lights with wide, wonder-filled eyes. "Where are we going, Mommy?" The word Mommy hit me like a physical blow, a title I hadn't earned and didn't know how to carry. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. "To the beginning, Julian," I whispered, my voice thick with a mixture of terror and a strange newfound resolve. We drove north, away from the glittering skyscrapers of Manhattan and the manicured lawns of Greenwich, toward the dark, brooding silhouettes of the Catskills. The luxury SUV felt like a lifeboat in a vast, dark ocean. Elena sat in the passenger seat, clutching her own medical records, her breathing as labored as the boys. We were a caravan of the broken, led by a woman who had spent her life building walls, now forced to tear them down to survive. When we finally reached the cabin, the snow had begun to fall in thick, heavy blankets, erasing the world behind us. The iron key turned in the lock with the same heavy thud as before, but this time, the scent of cedar and sandalwood didn't just feel like a memory, it felt like a sanctuary. I carried the boy inside, wrapping him in the faded blue blanket Julian had kept in the vault. The cabin was freezing, the air biting at our skin, but as I knelt by the hearth to start a fire, something I hadn't done with my own hands in years, I felt a sense of purpose that no board meeting had ever provided. Every spark that caught, every small flame that licked the dry wood, felt like a defiance against the darkness that had consumed my life. By midnight, the boy was asleep on the small cot, his breathing stabilized by the mountain air and the medicine Elena had expertly administered. She sat by the fire, her face etched with the exhaustion of a woman who had spent 5 years playing a role she never asked for. "He knew this would happen," she said, staring into the embers. "Julian knew they would freeze everything. He wanted you to lose the distraction of the wealth so you could see what was actually worth saving." I looked around the humble room, at the journals and the old photographs, and realized the treasure Julian had left wasn't the company or the millions in insurance. It was the clarity of having nothing left to lose except each other. I stood up, my legs aching, and walked to the loose floorboard where I had found the box earlier. Julian's voice in the video had mentioned one more thing, a final lie he kept for his own sake. I reached deeper into the crevice, my fingers brushing against something cold and heavy that I had missed before. It was a small, lead-lined canister, the kind used for transporting sensitive materials. My heart hammered. Was it more medicine? More documents? I pulled it out and wiped away the dust, finding a small note taped to the lid in Julian's unmistakable script. "The cure for my heart was always you, Sarah. But the cure for his is in here." I pried the lid open, expecting gold or diamonds to save us from poverty. Instead, I found a cryogenically preserved vial and a letter from a research lab in Switzerland dated only a week ago. My eyes raced across the scientific jargon until I reached the final sentence. The stem cell harvest from the father was successful. The transplant for the son is ready, but it requires a compatible legal guardian to sign for the experimental procedure, one who is willing to undergo a dangerous, direct marrow donation to bridge the gap. I looked at my hands, the hands that had only ever signed checks and contracts, and realized Julian hadn't left me a fortune to live on. He had left me a chance to bleed for the son I had once abandoned. The lead-lined canister felt heavier than any corporate merger I had ever negotiated, a cold weight of destiny resting in my palms. I stared at the vial, the liquid inside shimmering under the flickering firelight like a captured star. Julian had known. He had known that his own body was a failing vessel, but he had spent his final, agonizing months transforming his terminal illness into a biological bridge for our son. He hadn't just left me a child, he had left me a path to redemption that required my own flesh and blood. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. All those years I spent protecting my image and my time, Julian was preparing a scenario where the only way to save our legacy was for me to finally, physically give of myself. "The procedure," Elena whispered, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the hearth as she read the letter over my shoulder. "It's not just a transplant, Sarah. It's a direct, synchronized harvest. Because the stem cells are from a terminal donor, Julian, they need a living, healthy host to stabilize them during the transition. They need your marrow, your blood, your life force to act as a catalyst. It's dangerous. The mortality rate for the donor in these experimental cases is..." She trailed off, unable to voice the statistic. I looked over at the cot where Julian Jr. lay, his small chest rising and falling in that shallow, desperate cadence. He was a mirror of a man I had broken, a second chance wrapped in a blue blanket. For the first time in my life, I didn't ask about the cost. I didn't ask about the risks. "When can we start?" I asked, my voice devoid of the tremors that had plagued me all night. But the world outside wasn't finished with me yet. Just as I reached out to touch the boy's forehead, The quiet of the mountains was shattered by the crunch of heavy tires on frozen gravel and the blinding sweep of high-beam headlights cutting through the frosted windows. The vultures had arrived. I looked out the slit in the curtains and saw 3 black SUVs, the bank's recovery team, accompanied by a local sheriff. They weren't there for the money anymore. They were there to seize the assets of the estate, and in their cold, legal eyes, that included the medical canister and the very roof over our heads. Julian had bought this land back, but the paperwork hadn't cleared the frozen accounts in time. To them, we were just squatters in a repossessed dream. "They can't take him." "Elena," I hissed, my heart hammering against my ribs. "They take this canister, and he dies. They take us back to the city, and we lose the window for the surgery." I looked around the small cabin, my mind racing through strategies that didn't involve boardrooms or lawyers. I saw Julian's old hunting rifle above the mantel, a prop I had always mocked, but my eyes settled instead on the journals. Julian had documented everything, including the legal loopholes of this specific plot of land. I realized then that he had lured the auditors here for a reason. This cabin wasn't just a hideout, it was a jurisdictional trap. I stepped out onto the porch, the freezing air biting through my thin sweater, facing the men in suits who stood like statues against the snow. The sheriff stepped forward, his badge glinting. "Mrs. Vance, we have an order to vacate and seize all contents of the property." I didn't flinch. I held up the medical canister, its lead casing gleaming defiantly. "This is not property," I said, my voice echoing off the pines with a command I hadn't felt since the day I started my company. "This is a life-sustaining biological organ under federal medical protection. If you touch this cabin or anyone inside, you're not just repossessing a house, you're committing a felony under the Medical Emergency Act Julian filed 3 months ago." I saw the lead auditor hesitate, his eyes flickering to the sheriff. Julian had planned this. He had turned his own death into a legal fortress that only I could activate. The auditor stepped forward, a cruel smile twisting his lips as he held up a tablet. "Nice try, Sarah. But Julian Vance filed that act as a married man. This morning, your divorce was finalized by the state, triggered by his death certificate. You're not his wife, and you're not this boy's legal mother until the guardianship papers are processed in a court that no longer exists for you." He gestured to the sheriff. "Take the canister. It's an asset of the creditors now." I looked at the vial, then at the boy through the window, realizing that to save him, I was going to have to do the one thing I had spent my life avoiding. I was going to have to fight a war with nothing but my bare hands and a truth that would destroy me. The auditor's words hung in the frigid air like a guillotine blade. To the law, I was a stranger. To the bank, I was a liability. But to the boy shivering behind the cabin glass, I was the only wall between him and a cold, clinical death. I looked at the sheriff, a man whose eyes betrayed a flickering discomfort with the cruelty he was being asked to enforce. The lead auditor stepped onto the porch, his hand reaching for the canister with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been told no by someone with nothing left to lose. I didn't retreat. I gripped the lead-lined handle and felt the cold iron key Julian had given me digging into my palm. "You want assets?" I whispered, my voice dropping into a register of pure, lethal calm. "Then you better be prepared for the liability that comes with them." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the flash drive from the cabin, the one Julian had labeled for when the house was empty. I held it up like a detonator. "This drive contains the source code for my entire empire, the code Julian spent his final years perfecting. But it's encrypted with a biometric heartbeat sensor. If my pulse stops, or if this canister is opened by anyone other than a licensed surgeon at the clinic in Switzerland, the code self-destructs. Your creditors won't get a cent. Your bank will be left holding a handful of worthless servers and a pile of lawsuits." The auditor froze, his fingers inches from the canister. The silence that followed was heavy with the realization that I wasn't playing the game of a desperate widow. I was playing the game Julian had taught me. He had left me the cure not just to save the boy, but to give me the leverage to burn the world down if it tried to stop me. I saw the calculation in the auditor's eyes, the greed warring with the fear of a total loss. "You're bluffing," he spat, though his voice lacked conviction. I stepped closer, my face inches from his. "Try me. I've already lost my husband, my home, and my pride. Do you really think I care about your balance sheets?" I turned to the sheriff. "Officer, This boy is a ward of the state under a pending emergency guardianship. If you let them seize his life support, his death is on your badge. Call the judge, now." The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity. The only sound, the whistling wind, and the rhythmic thumping of my own heart, the very pulse that now held my empire hostage. Finally, the sheriff lowered his hand, stepping back. "I'm not touching this until I get a signature from a magistrate," he muttered, ignoring the auditor's frantic protests. I didn't wait for them to regroup. I backed into the cabin and bolted the door, the adrenaline finally giving way to a bone-deep exhaustion. I sank to the floor, clutching the canister to my chest, and watched as the headlights of the SUVs eventually retreated to the end of the driveway, waiting for the sun to rise and the legal battle to resume. I crawled over to the cot where Julian Jr. lay. His eyes were open, watching me with a quiet, ancient wisdom. "Did the angel win?" he asked, his voice a ghost of a sound. I took his small, frail hand and pressed it to my tear-stained cheek. "The angel is gone, Julian," I whispered. "But your mother is here, and I'm never letting go." I realized then that Julian's final selfish lie wasn't about the money or the company. It was the lie that I was an angel. He had told the boy that lie because he knew it was the only thing I would ever feel the need to live up to. He had built a pedestal so high that the only way I could stay on it was to become the person he always believed I could be. I opened the blue envelope Julian had hidden in the suitcase, the one he made me promise not to open until he was truly gone. Inside was a single plane ticket to Zurich and a small, gold locket. I snapped the locket open, expecting a photo of us. Instead, it was a tiny, high-definition microchip and a note that read, "The biometric lock isn't on the flash drive, Sarah. It's on the locket. It doesn't track your pulse. It tracks his. If he lives, you win it all. If he dies, we both go to sleep. Make him live." The locket felt heavy against my collarbone, its cold gold surface a physical reminder that my life was now inextricably tethered to a heartbeat that wasn't my own. Julian's final gamble was a masterpiece of emotional and technical engineering. He had ensured that my survival and my success were no longer about my ego, but about the preservation of his son. As the first light of a gray Connecticut dawn broke over the snow-covered pines, the sheriff's cruiser remained at the end of the drive, a silent sentinel protecting the legal limbo Julian had crafted. I didn't wait for the lawyers to return, or for the auditors to find a new loophole. With Elena's help and a secret medical transport arranged months ago by Julian's shadow network, we bypassed the local authorities under the cover of a mounting blizzard. By midday, we were over the Atlantic. The cabin in the Catskills, a fading memory, replaced by the sterile, high-tech sanctuary of a private clinic overlooking the white-capped peaks of the Swiss Alps. The clinic in Zurich didn't feel like a hospital. It felt like a fortress of glass and silence. Here, the noise of the New York Stock Exchange and the threats of the bank were echoes from another life. The lead surgeon, a man with hands as steady as the mountains outside, looked at me with a solemn understanding. "Julian Vance prepared for this for 3 years, he told me, his voice a soft, German-accented rumble. He knew his marrow was compromised by the disease, but yours, Sarah, yours is the missing piece. If we can merge the harvested stem cells with your living marrow in a synchronized transplant, we can rebuild the child's heart. But the procedure is brutal. You will be giving up more than just blood. You will be pushing your body to the edge of failure." I looked through the observation glass at Julian Jr., who was already being prepped for the surgery, his small body surrounded by humming machines. I didn't hesitate. "Take whatever you need," I said. "He is the only empire I have left." The hours that followed were a descent into a kaleidoscope of pain and white light. As they began the direct marrow harvest, I felt my strength draining away, a hollowing out of my very being. Every sharp throb in my bones felt like a debt being repaid, a penance for every cold word, every missed dinner, and every moment I had put my ambition above the man who was currently dying a second time within my own veins to save our son. In the hazy, morphine-blurred edges of my consciousness, I saw Julian. Not the gaunt, dying man from the hospital, but the boy from Brooklyn with the messy hair and the crooked smile, holding a single rose and telling me we were going to be legends. I realized then that he had never wanted me to be a queen, he just wanted me to be whole. When I finally drifted back to the surface of reality, the world was quiet. The harsh LED lights had been dimmed, and the only sound was the steady, strong beat of a heart monitor, not mine, but his. I opened my eyes to see Elena standing by my bed, her face wet with tears. "The transplant was a success, Sarah," she whispered. "The locket, it's glowing green." I looked down at the gold piece around my neck. The small indicator light was a vibrant, steady emerald. Julian Jr. was alive. His heart was no longer a ticking time bomb. It was a testament to a father's foresight and a mother's late-arriving grace. The auditors and the bank tried to reach me in Switzerland, but Julian's final selfish lie had one last layer. The moment the transplant was finalized, a dormant trust was activated that proved the debt I owed was actually a prepaid loan. Julian had settled years ago using a patent he had filed in my name. I wasn't bankrupt. I was the sole owner of a debt-free conglomerate, protected by Swiss sovereignty. But as I held Julian Jr., small, warm hand for the first time as his true mother, I realized I didn't want the crown. I sold the company a week later, giving the majority of the proceeds to cancer research at Sloan Kettering, keeping only enough to ensure a quiet life in the Catskills cabin. I finally understood what Julian meant by the beginning. It wasn't about where we started, it was about the place we returned to when everything else was stripped away. I wasn't an angel, and I wasn't a mogul. I was a woman who had finally learned that the greatest empire you can ever build is the one that lives in the heart of someone who loves you. As I sat on the porch of the cabin months later, watching a healthy Julian Jr. run through the pines, I snapped open the locket one last time. Behind the microchip was a hidden engraving I hadn't noticed before. It was in Julian's handwriting, small and perfect. "You were always enough, Sarah. I just had to help you find yourself." I looked up at the mountains, the wind finally feeling like a warm embrace rather than a cold shiver. For the first time in 10 years, the house wasn't empty.